Traditions and Encounters by McGraw Hill, 4th edition, Chapter 6, The Unification of China. Eyewitness, Sima Qian speaking truth to power in Han China. In about 99 BCE, Chinese imperial officials sentenced the historian Sima Qian to punish by castration. For just over a decade, Sima Qian had worked on a project that he had inherited from his father, a history of China from earliest times to his own day. That project brought Sima Qian high prominence at the imperial court. Thus, when he spoke in defense of a dishonored general, his views attracted widespread attention. The emperor reacted ferociously when he learned that Sima Qian had publicly expressed opinions that contradicted the ruler's judgment, and ordered the historian to undergo his humiliating punishment. Human castration was by no means uncommon in pre-modern times. Thousands of boys and young men of undistinguished birth underwent voluntary castration in China and many other lands, as well to pursue careers as eunuchs. Ruling elites often appointed eunuchs rather than nobles to sensitive posts because eunuchs did not sire families and so could not build power bases to challenge established authorities. As personal servants of ruling elites, eunuchs sometimes came to wield enormous power. Castration was not appealing alternative, however, to educated elites and other prominent individuals. Indeed, Chinese men of honor normally avoided the penalty by taking their own lives. Yet Sima Qian chose to endure his punishment. In a letter to a friend, he explained that suicide would mean that his work would go forever unwritten. To transmit his understanding of the Chinese past, Sima Qian adopted to live and work in disgrace until his death, about 90 BCE. During his last years, Sima Qian completed a massive work consisting of 130 chapters, most of which survive. He composed historical accounts of emperors' reigns and biographical sketches of notable figures, including ministers, statesmen, generals, empresses, aristocrats, scholars, officials, merchants, and rebels. He even described the societies of neighboring peoples with whom the Chinese sometimes conducted trade and sometimes made war. As a result, Sima Qian's efforts still provide the best information available about the development of early imperial China. A rich body of political and social thought prepared the way for the unification of China under Qin and Han dynasties. Confucians, Taoists, Legalists, and other formed schools of thought and worked to bring political and social stability to China. During the chaotic years of the late Zhou dynasty and the period of the warring states, legalist ideas contributed directly to unification by outlining means by which rulers could strengthen their states. The works of Confucians and the Taoists were not directly concerned with unification, but both schools of thought profoundly influenced Chinese political and cultural traditions over the long term. Rulers of the Qin and Han dynasties adopted legalist principles and imposed centralized imperial rule on all of China. Like the Achaemenids of Persia, the Qin and Han emperors ruled through an elaborate bureaucracy, and they built roads that linked the various regions of China. They went further than the Persian emperors in their efforts to foster cultural unity in their realm. They imposed a common written language throughout China and established an educational system based on Confucian thought and values. For almost 450 years, the Qin and Han dynasties guided the fortunes of China and established a strong precedent for centralized imperial rule. Especially during the Han Dynasty, Political stability brought economic prosperity. High agricultural productivity supported the development of iron and silk industries, and Chinese goods found markets in Central Asia, India, the Persian Empire, and even the Mediterranean basin. In spite of economic prosperity, however, later Han society experienced deep divisions between rich landowners and poor peasants. Those divisions eventually led to civil disorder and the emergence of political factions, which ultimately brought the Han dynasty to an end. In search of political and social order, the late centuries of the Zhou dynasty led eventually to the chaos associated with the period of the Warring States 403 to 221 BCE. Yet the political turmoil of that period was also resulted in a remarkable culture flowering because it forced thoughtful people to reflect on the proper roles of human beings in society. Some sought to identify principles that would restore political and social order. Others concerned themselves with the search for individual tranquility apart from society. Three schools of thought that emerged during those centuries of confusion and chaos, Confucianism, Taoism, and Legalism, exercised a particularly deep influence on Chinese political and cultural traditions. Confucianism. Confucius, the first Chinese thinker who addressed the problem of political and social order in a straightforward and self-conscious way, was Confucius, 551 to 479 BCE. Master philosopher Kong, as his disciples called him, or Confucius, as he is known in English. He came from an aristocratic family in the state of Lu in northern China, and for many years he sought an influential post at the Lu court. But Confucius was a strong-willed man who often did not get along well with others. He could be quite cantankerous. He was known to lodge bitter complaints. For example, if someone undercooked or overcooked his rice, not surprisingly, then he refused to compromise his beliefs in the interest of political expediency, and he insisted on observing principles that frequently clashed with state policy. As a result, Confucius was unable to obtain a high position at the Lu court. Confucius then sought employment with other courts in northern China, but after a decade of travel found none willing to accept his services. In 484 BCE, bitterly disappointed, he returned to Lu, where he died 5 years later. Although Confucius never realized his ambition, he left an enduring mark on Chinese society through his work as an educator and a political advisor. He attracted numerous disciples who aspired to political careers, and those disciples compiled to the master's sayings and teachings in a book known as the Analysts, a work that has profoundly influenced Chinese political and cultural traditions. Confucian Ideas. Confucius' thought was fundamentally moral, ethical, and political in character. It was also thoroughly practical. Confucius did not address philosophical or religious questions, but focused instead on the proper ordering of human relationships. In an age when bureaucratic institutions were not yet well developed, Confucius believed that the best way to promote good government was to fill official positions with individuals who were both well educated and extraordinarily conscientious. Thus, Confucius concentrated on the formation of what he called Junzi, superior individuals who do not allow personal interest to influence their judgments. In the absence of an established educational system and a formal curriculum, Confucius had his disciples study works of poetry and history that provided insight into human nature. He and his students carefully examined works produced during the Zhou dynasty, such as the Book of Songs, the Book of History, and the Book of Rites, concentrating especially on their practical value for prospective administrators. As a result of Confucius' influence, literary works of the Zhou dynasty became the core text of the traditional Chinese education. For more than 2,000 years, until the early 20th century CE, talented Chinese seeking government posts followed a program of study deriving from the one developed by Confucius in the 5th century BCE. Confucian values. For Confucius, though ideal government officials needed more than an advanced education, they also needed a strong sense of moral integrity and a capacity to deliver wise and fair judgments. Several qualities were particularly important to Confucius. One of them he called Ren, by which he meant an attitude of kindness and benevolence, or a sense of humanity. Confucius explained that individuals possessing Ren were courteous, respectful, diligent, and loyal, characteristics desperately needed in government officials. Another quality in central importance was Li, a sense of propriety which called for individuals to behave appropriately. They should treat all other human beings with courtesy while showing special respect for difference to elders or superiors. Yet another quality that Confucius emphasized was Jiao, filial pity, which obliged children to respect their parents and other family elders, look after their welfare, support them in old age, and remember them along with other ancestors after their deaths. Confucius emphasized personal qualities such as Ren, Li, and Jiao because he believed that individuals who possessed those traits would gain influence in the larger society and in the process would lead others by their example. Only through enlightened leadership by morally strong individuals, Confucius believed, was there any hope for the restoration of political and social order in China. Thus, his goal was not simply a cultivation of personal morality for its own sake, but also the creation of Junzi, who could bring order and stability to China. Because Confucius expressed his thought in general terms, later disciples could adapt it to the particular problems of their times. Indeed, the flexibility of Confucian that helps to account for its remarkable longevity and influence in China. Two later disciples of Confucius, Mencius and Zunzi, illustrate especially well the ways in which Confucian thought lent itself to adaptation. Mencius, 372 to 289 BCE, was the most learned man of his age and the principal spokesman for the Confucian school. During the period of the Warring States, he traveled widely throughout China as a political advisor. Mencius firmly believed that human nature was basically good. Thus, he placed social emphasis on the Confucian virtue of Ren and advocated government by benevolence and humanity. This principle implied that rulers would levy light taxes, avoid wars, support education, and encourage harmony and cooperation. In his lifetime, Mencius's advice had little practical effect, and critics charged that his views about human nature were naive. Over the long term, however, his ideas deeply influenced the Confucian tradition since about the 10th century CE. Many Chinese scholars have considered Mencius the most authoritative of Confucian's early expositors. Junji. Like Confucius and Mencius, Junji 298 to 238 BCE was a man of immense learning, but unlike his predecessors, he also served for many years as a government administrator. His practical experience encouraged him to develop a less optimistic view of human nature than Mencius. Junji believed that human beings selfishly pursued their own interest and resisted making any voluntary contribution to the larger society. He considered strong social discipline the best means to bring order to society. Thus, whereas Mencius emphasized the Confucian quality of Ren, Junji emphasized Li. He advocated the establishment of a clear, well-publicized standards of conduct that would set limits on the pursuit of individual interest and punish those who neglected their obligations to the larger society. Like Confucius and Mencius, however, Junji also believed that it was possible to improve human beings and restore order to society. The fundamental optimism was a basic characteristic of Confucian thought. It explains the high value that Confucian thinkers placed on education and public behavior, and it accounts also for their activist approach to public affairs. Confucians involved themselves in society. They sought government positions and made conscientious efforts to solve political and social problems and to promote harmony in public life. By no means, however, did the Confucians win universal praise for their efforts. To some of their contemporaries, Confucian activism represented little more than misspent energy. Taoism. Among the most prominent of these critiques were the Taoists. Like Confucianism, Taoism developed in response to the turbulence of the late Zhou dynasty and the period of the warring states, but unlike the Confucians, the Taoists considered it pointless to waste time on social activism. Instead, the Taoists devoted their energies to reflection and introspection in the hopes that they could understand how to live in harmony with the natural principles that govern the world. The Taoists believed that over time this approach would bring harmony to society as a whole, as people ceased to meddle in affairs that they could not understand or control. Laozi and Daiji. According to Chinese tradition, the founder of Taoism was a sage named Laozi, who lived during the 6th century BCE. Although there might have been historical Laozi, it is almost certain that several thinkers contributed to the Daoji classic of the way of and of virtue, the basic exposition of Taoist beliefs traditionally ascribed to Laozi, and the book acquired its definitive form over several centuries. After the Daoji, the most important Taoist work was the Zhuangzi, named after its author, the philosopher Zhuangzi, 369 to 286 BCE, who provided a well-reasoned compendium and of Taoist views. The Tao. The Taoism represented an effort to understand the fundamental character of the world and nature. The central concept of Taoism is the elusive concept of Tao, meaning the way, or more specifically, the way of nature, or the way of the cosmos. In the Tao Jing, Tao figures as the original force of the cosmos, an eternal principle that governs all the workings of the world. The Tao Jing envisioned Tao as a passive force that acted in perfect harmony with the principles of nature. Thus, Tao resembles water, which is soft and yielding, yet is also so powerful that it eventually erodes even the hardest rock placed in its path. Tao also resembles the cavity of a pot. Although it is nothing more than empty space, it makes the pot a useful tool. Taoists believe that human beings should live in harmony with the passive and yielding nature of Tao. To the Taoist, that meant retreating from the world of politics and administration. Ambition and activism had only brought the world to a state of chaos. The proper response to that situation was to cease frantic striving and with a sense of selfless detachment. The doctrine of Wu. Thus, early Taoists recognized as the chief moral virtue the trait of Wu, disengagement from active involvement in worldly affairs. Wu required that individuals refrain from advanced education and personal striving, and that they live simply, unpretentiously, and in harmony with nature. Wu also had implications for state and society. The less government, the better. Instead of expansive kingdoms, the Tao Jing envisioned a world of tiny, self-sufficient communities where people had no desire to conquer their neighbors or even to trade or visit with them. Although Taoist thought opposed the activism of Confucianism, in fact, the Taoist encouraged for self-knowledge appealed strongly to many Confucians. And since neither Confucianism nor Taoism was an exclusive faith, it was possible for individuals to study the Confucian curriculum and take administrative posts in the government while devoting their private hours to reflection on human nature and the place of humans in the larger world, to live as Confucians by day, as it were, and Taoist by night. Legalism. Ultimately, neither Confucianism, activism, nor Taoist retreat was able to solve the problems of the period of warring states. Order returned to China only after the emergence of a third school of thought, that of Legalist, which promoted a practically and ruthlessly efficient approach to statecraft. Unlike the Confucians and legalists, the legalists did not concern themselves with ethics, morality, or propriety. Unlike Taoists, the legalists cared nothing about the place of human beings in nature. Excuse me. Instead, they devoted their attention exclusively to the state, which they sought to strengthen and expand at all cost. Shang Yang and Han Feizi. Legalist doctrine emerged from the insights of men who were active in Chinese political affairs during the late 4th century BCE. Most notable of them was Shang Yang, circa 390 to 338 BCE, who served as chief minister to the Duke of Ken state in western China. His policy survived in a wartime title The Book of Lord Shang. Through a clever and efficient administrator, Shang Yang was despised because of his power and ruthlessness. Thus, when his patron died, Shang's enemies at court executed him, mutilated his body, and annihilated his family. Another legalist theory, Han Fizi, circa 280 to 233 BCE, also fell afoul of ambitious men at the Qin court. During his life, Han Fizi synthesized legalist ideas in a collection of powerful and well-argued essays on statecraft. However, his enemies forced him to commit suicide by taking poison. Thus, the legalist state itself consumed the two foremost exponents of legalist doctrine. The legalist doctrine. Shang Yang, Han Fizi, and other legalists reasoned that the foundations of the state's strengths were agriculture and armed forces, since both lines of work directly advanced the interest of the state. Legalists sought to channel as many individuals as possible into cultivation or military service. Meanwhile, they discouraged others from pursuing what they believed were less useful careers as merchants, entrepreneurs, scholars, educators, philosophers, poets, or artists. The legalists expected to harness subjects' energy by means of clear and strict laws, hence the name legalist. Their faith in laws distinguished the legalists clearly from Confucians, who relied on education and example to introduce individuals to behave appropriately. The legalists believed that this was not enough. To persuade individuals to serve the needs of the state, they imposed a strict legal regimen that clearly outlined expectations and provided severe punishment for violators. They believed that if people feared to commit small crimes, they would hesitate all the more before committing great crimes. Thus, legalists imposed harsh penalties for even minor infractions. Individuals could suffer amputation of the hands or feet, for example, for disposing trash in the street. The legalists also established the principles of collective responsibility for the law, whereby all members of the family or community were liable to be punished along with the actual violator. The legalist principles of government did not win them much popularity, yet legalist doctrine lent itself readily to practical application. The legalist principles of government quickly produced remarkable results for rulers who adopted them. In fact, legalist methods put an end to the period of the warring states and brought about the unification of China. This is the end of Dr. Fan's reading assignment.